Well, I'd like to welcome in a couple of people to discuss civil unrest, Black Lives Matter, and some of their experiences in the soccer realm in particular as Black members of that community, a player and a coach. First, the player, Allyson Swaby, her hometown, West Hartford, Connecticut, captain of her high school team, Hill High School, captain at Boston College. A member of the Jamaican national team that qualified for their very first World Cup last summer. And she's now playing in Italy's Serie A for AS Roma. Then there's John Morgan. John is the top assistant at the University of Tennessee, the women's program there, former assistant and head coach at the University of Maryland. He worked with me on a couple of teams at Rutgers University and the Players Development Academy, the PDA, Dover, Delaware native, graduate of Rowan University, which I think was Glassboro State back then, but welcome to you both. Allyson, let's go to you first, and thank you so much for sharing. For you in particular, it's been a rather disruptive year. So you signed with Roma, which is a massive deal for you, but then coronavirus strikes, and Italy is like the major hotspot where it really hit early on. And we read and saw all the different things, and then you come home, and now we have the murder of George Floyd, the protests, and you've been very vocal on social media and through some articles too. So, just maybe describe your year a little bit to us.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to even remember like January. That feels like it was 2 whole years ago at this point. But yeah, I mean, my team, obviously in Italy, we were doing well. We were fourth in the table, but it was a pretty tight race between us, Milan and Fiorentina. And so we were pretty focused on just getting ourselves back into a Champions League position. And, we kind of were peaking pretty much right when coronavirus really came and started hindering what was going on for us. And so, yeah, it was really similar to kind of how it kind of took over here in the US as well, where you're hearing about it. It's not directly in Rome yet. We know it's kind of been an outbreak in certain areas, but it hasn't too directly affected us. And then games here and there started getting called off. And then it was pretty much like over one weekend where it was pretty clear that we weren't going to be able to resume. So
you made it home.
I ended up coming back home because there was so much, there's so much uncertainty. And pretty much at that point, all the foreign players kind of returned home just because we didn't know when we'd be able to resume again. And so I've been home now for a few months, and basically the whole time up until 2 days ago when they officially called off our season, we've just been training on our own. We've had programs that we can do, but it's been a little difficult because some people had tighter lockdowns in certain areas and some people had a lot more freedom in what they could do in terms of training and things like that. So it's been hard, obviously, to stay mentally motivated when you didn't really know what was going to happen and for such a long time. And then, so that season kind of ended. And then, here we are now, and we're dealing with a lot of civil issues. Obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement has resurged, and we're seeing it again all over the media, everywhere you look. It's impossible to ignore it. And coronavirus has definitely played a huge role in that, because people are at home, people are on their phones, people are watching media a lot more than they would be if they were going to their normal 9 to 5. So it's pretty much in everyone's faces at this point. And it's impossible to ignore and kind of reflect on yourself and figure out, where you can fit into the movement.
John Morgan, you've been involved on both sides too, with as a coach trying to keep your team engaged during COVID and the isolations and the remote training. And then something hits like this, the murder of George Floyd, the subsequent protests. And I'm just wondering how you gathered all that in yourself, and you're dealing with young people at the same time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Glenn, first off. And, it's a pleasure to be here with you and with Allyson. The pandemic itself was just kind of like, wow, are we really experiencing this? And are we really having this? I think our kids left campus March 13th for spring break, but had to be prepared that they weren't going to be coming back to school after break. We really didn't have a clear path in terms of what we were going to do. And so there was in case we can't come back, or in case we can come back, who would want to come back and who wouldn't feel comfortable coming back and would want to go home. So we kind of had to navigate our way through that. I think biggest portion of the kids wanted to be back, but with conversations with their family, they felt like they needed to go home. And so, COVID starts, we're away from each other, trying to figure out what's the best path with our kids, and how much time do we try to spend with them on Zoom? How much work do we give them? All that being said, they're still trying to get through exams and those type of finals. And so kids are a little stressed. Kids are home. Kids are looking for things to do. And, none of us really have any answers, right? And, kind of alluding to what Allyson said, it's like now all of a sudden we have this George Floyd incident, and not really an incident, not trying to downplay it, it's horrible. But now our kids they're home, they're reading, they're watching television, they're getting all these emotions themselves, and nobody really knows how to handle those emotions, right? And some kids and staff of our program, there's rage, and there's just anger, and then we want to go protest, and then there's kids that don't really understand the why and why it's all going on and what happened, and why the police are acting the way the police are acting, and why are there so many different reactions. There's a lot of kids, we're all trying to figure that out. But for our team and for our staff, we've just tried to have as much conversation that is genuine and that is organic and authentic, without it being staged or without it putting too much pressure on any individual or individuals. And I think I've said a few things. Our coach Penske has said a few things. Our players have done a really good job of kind of coming together and putting together their thoughts. And you'll see a video that's coming out here shortly in terms of how they feel about this George Floyd situation and the pandemic, and just humanity, and just kind of the direction that we want to go as a society. And what's really cool is that the young people are the ones that are going to make this change, right? And so with our kids taking this initiative, we're excited, because excuse me, but this is hard for everybody, right? I think as people of color, we can talk about what's upsetting and what's difficult and what's challenging for us, and we can protest, and we can give our thoughts and opinions. But ultimately, we need to have white people help us make these changes, right? They have the leverage to make these changes. And you go back to the Rodney King situation and the protests and the rioting and looting. It was all one color, right? And now you go to the George Floyd situation, and it's multiple shades. It's all colors. And in a weird way, that's really exciting, because a lot of people are touched by it. A lot of people are enraged by it. A lot of people want to make change. And you also look at a lot of these faces, they're young faces, and our kids are a part of that. And if our country is going to make some change, it's got to happen through those young kids. And it's not just unique to Tennessee in our program, but we're seeing it from college campuses all over the country, from different athletic programs, different sports all over the country. And sometimes you need to have a little setback in order to go forward. And so maybe this is our setback here.
I think this is a time, John and Allyson, let's play a piece from a recent interview I did with Eric Miller. Eric is with the Major League Soccer Players Association. They just reached an agreement on a CBA, and now they're going to Orlando to play in this tournament beginning July the 8th. But Eric, he grew up in Minnesota, in St. Paul, in the suburbs. So I had this conversation with him, and then we'll get your reaction. You know, your connection to Minnesota runs deep. You did play there with Minnesota United, but it goes beyond that. You grew up there, played for Bangor's Tsunami, Minnesota Thunder, parts of those 2 seasons with United. Your wife, Cassie Coleman, and her family, they're pretty much a soccer legendary family in Minnesota. So what has it been like for you and Cassie to watch from afar and see what's going on with all the civil unrest?
Yeah, I think it's been a surreal experience. I think for me personally, I'm a white dude that grew up in the suburbs of St. Paul, so it's not really time for me to give my opinion or time for me to voice what I need to do. It's time for me to listen. And I think I need to listen. I need to donate money to funds and to people that are going to hopefully take this country into a better direction. And I think for us, it's just kind of, and I think for all white people in the United States, it's time to take a little bit of a backseat and just really listen to people that are more informed about this stuff and can hopefully help solve these numerous problems that we have. I think it's crazy to see it happen in Minneapolis, in a place that we don't live too far south of. And I think it's really, really sad, and it makes you really angry. But again, I think it's just time for me to listen and to kind of let people who are smarter than me and know more about this stuff tell me what needs to happen, and in whatever way I can be an ally, in whatever way I can help financially, I need to do that stuff. And that's about all I can do. I need to obviously learn and evaluate myself. But I think most importantly, it's just time for people like me to listen.
Yeah, you mentioned surreal. So you're watching on TV places where you've walked around and shopped, and it's just got to be almost horrifying.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think surreal is the perfect word. I mean, especially, I almost didn't have time to like process everything because we were in the midst of all this crazy MLSPA, MLS stuff, that this stuff was kind of going on. And it was like, this MLSPA stuff is so unimportant really in the grand scheme of things in terms of race relations in the United States. So I think for me, it's now my time to process and educate myself and to really understand what's going on, and then hopefully just be an ally to all the Black people in the United States and help out in whatever way that I can.
So Allyson, so Eric said, not time for me to give my opinion, it's time to listen. And he's saying that as a white man in the community. So what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I definitely think that where Eric has started is definitely a great place. You know, a lot of people can be super intimidated when entering these conversations and finding their role and their place in the Black Lives Matter movement. And the easiest way to enter when you're uncertain is honestly just to listen. So hearing that he's willing to hear people, Black people specifically, talking about their oppression, things that are directly affecting them, is a huge step in the right direction. And he also alluded to the fact that he's donating to causes, and, you know, that's a form of action. And there are lots of other forms of action. So, I mean, just finding what you're comfortable with at first as a way to enter the conversation, but then also being able to understand that it won't be a comfortable process the entire time. There's going to be a lot of things about it that are, for the most part, very uncomfortable. So figuring out how you can continue to push yourself and listening, like I said, is able to find your place within the movement.
Yeah, so you're good with listening because they're not to him specifically, but there was some pushback where you see on social media in particular. That's where we're seeing a lot of the commentary that some people in the Black community, they don't want to hear about listening, they want to hear about action.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, it's really just the entry point. It's not the direct actions yet, but I think that you know, it's the way to enter the door and find a place for yourself. You know, it seems like he has moved on to action. So I definitely think he's headed in the right direction, and the thoughts he's having are definitely valid, and people can definitely learn from his standpoint on it.
I want to read something that you posted, a brave Instagram post, and then it was tweeted out by AS Roma. So June 5th would have been the 27th birthday of Breonna Taylor, the African American emergency services worker who was shot and killed by Louisville police in her home on March the 31st. So on your Instagram, it was saying happy birthday, Breonna Taylor. And then you went on and talked about some things. And this sounds like mostly maybe at Boston College, maybe with teammates, classmates. You started it by saying, quote, honestly, I was conflicted on whether to share this because I don't want to fill up any more space in a crowded room, but I want to speak to all of my non-Black followers and friends, which quite frankly is a lot of you. So here are some of them. Some of your experiences, what you had to do. Number one, explaining to white friends why they cannot say or sing the N-word, only for them to continue using it over and over. Being told I'm Black as shit by a teammate. Being told no Black people allowed in a group photo by a teammate. Being asked, how come your sister is so light? Being told I'm pretty for a Black girl. Listening to a teammate chant, build the wall while watching the news, and being told, you know damn well you wouldn't have gotten into Boston College if it wasn't for soccer. Now, I mean, some of these things are brutal. I'm curious as to whether you just internalized all this or ever spoke to anybody about it, but my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, you know, I definitely internalized a lot of it. Mainly brushed a lot of it off as just ignorance and people not understanding the power of their words. Because I mean, these are people that if you ask them, are you racist? They're gonna tell you no. So, I mean, I definitely, in some of the situations, there definitely were confrontations and discussions that were had, and some of them were definitely just brushed off. And I think that's something that you'll hear from a lot of Black people, especially Black students at predominantly white institutions, that, you know, a lot of the fights are, I mean, they're worth it, but it's so frequent that it's like you kind of have to pick what you're gonna give your mental energy to, what you're gonna let drain you. And for the most part, I always looked at it as like, let me stay focused on what I'm here to accomplish. And looking back on it now, that also has a lot to do with maturity. Like now I know the things that I stand for, and I know what I would and would not allow to be said around me or to someone around me. And that's drastically different than what it was 2 years ago, but that comes with my own personal growth. And like I said, also, I didn't really write any of this for sympathy or anything like that. It was just to show people another perspective, people that get really caught up on the direct forms of racism, who don't see it as something that can be covert. I just really wanted to shed light to, you know, how it can exist in our own communities and our own society, not just something that only exists in these random places across America and across the world. So I decided to share my story just because I thought that it could definitely reach a different audience than other stories. And like also for me, it was just a huge relief to kind of get a lot of these things off my shoulders and let people know that, you know, I heard you. Maybe I didn't say anything at the time, but I heard you, I remember, and it's formed me and it shaped me into the person that I am today, which is huge.
What I wanted to ask after I read them, I wondered if, so obviously those are some teammates or just students, you know, that you were friendly with or hung out with. Have you heard from any of them? Did anybody see that and get back to you and know that they were maybe one of those?
Yeah, a lot of people reached out, and I also addressed people that might have been in the room that they didn't say it, but they heard it. And a lot of those people that, I mean, you can call them bystanders or whatever, they were the ones who were actually the most receptive to what I wrote, because quite frankly, they were specific incidents and people who were there remembered them. And so a lot of them did reach out, you know, saying, you know, along the lines of, I wish I had known what I know now. I wish I had had the courage to say something, like I would never let these things happen now, type of things. And, you know, it's great to hear that. And I'm glad that it caused reflection, but, you know, there's still, I think that's, again, one of the first steps is being able to acknowledge that you were wrong, that you may have wronged someone. And now moving forward, it's all about action and address these things and make sure that like when our kids are going to college, they're not dealing with the same types of things, or that if they are, we're able and we're comfortable to have discussions and conversations that dispel anything like that.
Well, you just have to hope that they're willing and able to pass it on, as they have shared it with you. So, John, you and Allison, similar in that you're reaching out to the white community in particular. I want to read what the University of Tennessee women's soccer Twitter account put out, a statement from you after the George Floyd murder and the protests. You wrote, please don't stand aside when you hear or see something that's offensive to race and humanity. You can help change your generation and future generations by standing up. You must know it's not the responsibility of the people of color to stop racism. The voices that carry the most leverage in making change are our majority white family.
Yeah, I'm still bummed out right now listening to Allison's quote. And
that's the first you heard that?
It's the first I heard it, and I'm not surprised, but I am surprised. And Allyson, I hate that you had to go through that. You know, we've all had our own experiences, but that's kudos for you for being strong enough to stay on your path. You know, Glenn, when I wrote that, it was actually, it was a message to our team. And that was just a little excerpt from that message. It took me a while, when the Floyd thing happened and we had all of these, the protesting in Minneapolis, and then it spread throughout our country. I was really just trying to get my thoughts together, and I knew I wanted to say something. I didn't really know what I wanted to say, but I knew that I had to say something so that our kids, one, knew that how I feel and how I'm affected by it, but also how a lot of people of color feel. And then just kind of what their role is. Our team is majority white. We have, we have some kids of color, but it's probably, for all the years that we've been coaching, it's probably the team that has the least amount of kids of color. And so I wanted them to also feel like they have a voice and it's a safe space within our team. And hopefully, with what I'm saying, represent how they feel as well, and so that was the purpose. It was really well received by our team. I feel wholeheartedly that, and I said it earlier, that this generation is going to be the one that makes the change. This generation has to be the one that makes the change. And it has to be people that are representative of all backgrounds that are behind it. And that was really the purpose of the comments to the team. Them putting it out on Twitter was a little bit of a surprise, but I'm glad that it was out there. A lot of people needed to hear it because a lot of people just don't know, right? They kind of live their own lives, and you only know what you know, and usually that's what your circle is. And so sometimes these prejudices and these racial biases are just, a lot of people just don't realize it, right? They're just kind of in their circle, and then
well, an example could be like just comments, maybe some of the ones that Allyson, gave as an example. It's just those kind of comments and not thinking anything of it.
Absolutely. And it doesn't make it right, but it comes from a place of just experience, right? And, I think Allyson, we're in a tough sport because it's predominantly white, and it's predominantly, like a middle class, upper middle class white sport as well. And so the experiences of our girls of color and a lot of these white kids are very, very different. And so oftentimes, in college, first time, a white girl has played with a black girl might be in college, right? There's obviously there's club situations, but it may be the first time that they've really had a black friend, right? And so how do they handle that relationship without having any background or any experience? And so things sometimes get said that probably, people want to take back. Things get said that people didn't really give much thought to. Doesn't necessarily mean it came from a nasty place. It just comes from a unknowing place. And so as we move forward, we've got to have more, I think, interaction. And I think when I say leverage, white people need to put themselves out there more, right? And listen and ask questions and really try to understand, the people that they're with.
John Morgan with us. He's the assistant at the University of Tennessee on the women's side. Allyson Swaby. I've almost called you Chantel 2 or 3 times, trying to your younger sister. Very cool that you both got to play together for the Jamaican national team at the World Cup last summer. How great was that?
It's really cool, and I cannot believe it was a whole year ago. Like, I'm getting memories on my phone and things like telling me like, oh, this was 1 year ago today, and I'm like, where does the time go?
Yeah. Well,
that was sorry, Glenn. Like, we obviously had former player at Tennessee on that team with Allyson and Chantel, and then we also have unfortunately, G didn't get to make that World Cup.
Yeah,
she was part of the qualifying. Kid tore her ACL a month before the World Cup, and that whole story, just from where, having been a little bit on the inside and familiar with the resources that you guys had, the struggles that you guys had, just getting players there, getting to the World Cup itself, hotels and flights, just, it's such a remarkable story. I hope that they're able to put some sort of documentation together of this story, because what you guys accomplished, it's massive. And especially considering what you didn't have in terms of resources compared to many of the other nations. And so fantastic, congratulations. And I'm still bummed for G. She was part of that qualifying. She deserved to be there,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, but the good thing is we had a really young squad. We were the youngest team at the World Cup. And so in 4 years, a lot of our players will actually be like in their peak physique, if they choose to keep playing. So that's something that makes me really optimistic, is that in 4 years, I think we'll have grown a lot, and we'll already have had that experience under our belt to hopefully, have more success the next time around.
Allyson, the club that you play for, and you look at the men's side, and there was a headline last season in an Italian newspaper, Corriere dello Sport, and it had the headline Black Friday because it was Roma versus Milan in a huge match, and it was Chris Smalling and Romelu Lukaku, who are both African American gentlemen, who were pictured with this headline Black Friday. At this time where, the sensitivity issue of race, had been highlighted worldwide, it just seems like the Italian community is still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, definitely. There's obviously a different dynamic with race there. Just in general, because the diversity is completely different than what it is in the US. It kind of speaks back to what John was saying about, a lot of people just not knowing and not getting it. Like, to think that you could use a headline like that and see that nothing is wrong with it speaks so loudly to the idea of white privilege, that you can live in a society and think that it's okay to use race in that way and have it not be offensive or have it not be looked at as highly inappropriate. And again, I think that it all comes down to the actions that are being taken when things like this happen, and the accountability that clubs are having when they have fans yelling racist things, what are they doing, accept it, or do they have policies in order to make sure that these things don't happen? And I think that's where, you have the listening piece that comes first, and then immediately people want to hear you verbalizing how you're going to fix it, how you're going to prevent it from happening in the future. And, when that particular article came out, Rome removed the press access to that paper for a bit of time. And, obviously that's action. And also Roma is one of the clubs that is more vocal, more willing to, relay stories by their athletes and things like that. But, there's definitely a gap from what a club like Roma is willing to do and what another club is willing to do. And again, that comes from what the league requires and demands when it comes to racially based offenses. And, I just don't think there's enough in place right now. Yeah, I think they're learning along with a lot of other leagues in Europe and around the world. And, hopefully they can learn from each other's examples instead of waiting for it to actually directly affect their league.
Well, and what has to be also said is the Serie A had an anti-racism campaign. And John, I don't know if you saw this, but it was 3 heads of monkeys that were pictured. That's about as tone deaf as it gets, since it's the monkey chants is part of the and even at a Roma match in 2019, apparently there were Roma fans that made monkey chants against another team. So even with a club that's really, conscious and sensitive to it, it's still happening. But I mean, that's where you see that and you think, God, we have miles to go. I know we're talking mostly about the States today, but gee whiz, it is a global issue.
It is a global issue. And I mean, Italy, I mean, just Europe in general is, you talk about how many people you see that are like you and how many people you see that don't look like you. Well, there aren't a whole lot of people, and Allyson can attest to it, that probably look like Allyson and me, when you're in Italy. And so again, back to sensitivity and back to understanding, those nations have a pretty long ways to go. You think about it, civil rights, human rights, all of that just really came in place in the 60s, right? We're 60 years from that. And it didn't necessarily mean as soon as those bills were signed that people just stopped being racist, or stopped having prejudices. And so those generations, they have children and they pass along their messages, and they have kids. And, we do have a long ways to go. We're not very far from it, and here in Knoxville, and I've been in Knoxville for 4 years, and it's been absolutely wonderful experience, and an experience that I very honestly didn't anticipate being so great, and I haven't dealt with any type of real racism, maybe some microaggression stuff, but nothing that's really been outwardly and overtly in my face. But however, just this past Friday, we had a parade and a march and a protest in our what's called our square. And this story is tough because just considering the time, right, and where we're at and what's going on. And I was in my room, my fiance was in our living room, and she heard this noise and just heard some loud thing going on in the background. So she got up, she went to the window, and she sees 2 cyclists, a white cyclist, a black cyclist, and there was a pickup truck behind them, and a guy with a loudspeaker. And the guy with the loudspeaker was yelling out, "Nigger alert, N-word alert," okay? And yeah. And meanwhile, there is a parade that is about to happen here, a march that's about to happen. And this is going on. So she was just floored and upset, and we both were upset. Well, 20 minutes later, I went outside of our building, and there was police that were setting up. We lived close to where the protest was going to be. And I asked them if they had heard about this truck and what was going on. And There was 3 of them, and it was a woman, and she looked at me kind of with a blank stare. Another officer looked at me and then said, "Yeah, we heard it," and then went back to doing what he was doing. And then the 3rd officer comes up to me and says, "Hey, freedom of speech, First Amendment." And then he points down the street, and you can see the marchers for the protests going down the street. And he goes, just like them, shrugs his shoulders, and then turns away. Okay, so.
Well, that lends itself to a lot of what the conversation is. And U.S. Soccer coming out with a statement. I wonder what you guys think of this. On the repeal of Policy 6041, the U.S. Soccer Board of Directors voted this past week about players requiring players to stand during the national anthem. The policy was put in place after Megan Rapinoe kneeled in solidarity with Colin Kaepernick, who was protesting police brutality at the time with the San Francisco 49ers. And that policy has been overturned by U.S. Soccer. Is that a major statement when the federation does that, when MLS comes out and reiterates their stance, NWSL? Is that important, Allyson?
Yeah, I mean, that's a form of action that they can take, and they're willing to do it. I mean, it doesn't neglect the fact that they had the policy in place in the first place. So it's a simple thing to do, but they still need to get to the root of why they thought that was an acceptable policy to have in place. And yeah, just talking back about freedom of speech, it's very clear how that freedom of speech can be misinterpreted or interpreted very differently for a white man going down the street yelling the N-word and a black man wanting to kneel and peacefully protest. So I think you look at that and you see the sheer double standard of what it means to have freedom of speech and to peacefully protest in your own country. And I think, yeah, this is a step in the right direction, but it's not the only act of solidarity that athletes have done, and there will be more. So I guess it's more so important to see how these large leagues react in the future to forms of peaceful protest.
Allyson, have you yourself, and I want to ask you the same thing, John, have you ever been racially profiled? And if not, what's the most egregious thing that's occurred during your life because of your skin color?
I mean, for me, again, I grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut, and it's a predominantly white community, but it's a bubble. It's a lot different than a lot of other places. And, for the most part, I never had to experience anything overtly racist growing up. And, I'm grateful for that. But at the same time, I got to college and I saw a lot of things that I wasn't ready to see or didn't know that I would experience. But I mean, I wouldn't say I've been the recipient of incredible racism. And I understand that that could be due to, where I am in society, being an athlete, having a voice. And some people are not in as privileged of positions to be able to have certain things that might protect from that. But, for me, I mean, I've been in stores, of course, where, I mean, you can feel the eyes literally shift to you when you enter the room. And you've been identified as someone that's Black, that's shopping, and nobody has to say anything. No one has to make any direct comment, but you can literally feel a person's energy suddenly become surrounded around you. And again, that's another example of something that no matter how many times I try to explain or tell someone, you don't know what that feels like unless it's happening to you. And again, that just speaks to white privilege in itself. But those have been my types of experiences, and obviously they're minimal in terms of what can really happen.
But the unspoken, the nonverbal that you just described, John, that's equally painful, isn't it?
It's exhausting. It's exhausting because, sometimes, not go back to your original question, I've never dealt with anything with the police. I've never been mistreated. I've never been, I just haven't dealt with anything like that. And I'm thankful. Maybe I'm fortunate. but I have many of friends that have been. I think these little, we'll go back to these microaggressions and these, because they're all the time. You know, those are the things that you see and feel all the time. And yeah, no, maybe they're not saying something and they're vocal about it, but it's really the same thing, isn't it? It's you know, it's the same discrimination just because of the color of your skin. And you know, again, another story. Like, I've lived in New Jersey, I've lived in DC, Delaware, Ohio, really a lot of places up the coast and up north, and now down here in Tennessee. And it's the same everywhere. It's the same everywhere. And I know a lot of my northern friends want to say, well, is that just because it's a southern thing, or is it? No, same stuff happened up there, you know. Don't be naive and think that just because you're up north that these things don't go on. They do. You know, simple things as, you know, you see a woman walking and she passes 3 white guys and there's no problem, and she comes up to me and she grabs her purse and secures her purse like she's holding on to a football, you know, and then she walks past. Nothing was said, nothing was done, but just that action is kind of, you know, you say inside, you're like, are we serious? Like, what's going here? What makes me a threat right now? You know, and so those are the little things that I think Allyson can agree that we kind of deal with those things probably a lot more often than we do with the overt stuff.
I'll tell a couple of stories as a white guy, where, and they're seminal moments for me, because I grew up in a town, Basking Ridge, that had 2 black families. So, you know, I was in one of those bubbles, as you described it, Allyson, that kind of a community. And I took a job at Long Island University, downtown Brooklyn, Flatbush Avenue, probably 80 to 90% black in the community. And the school mixture was very similar. And I remember going down in one of my early days, and there was a McDonald's, you know, really close by, and I was just hungry, so I went into the McDonald's. And apparently, well, what I learned later is that, you know, white people didn't go into that McDonald's. And I went in, and the eyes that you described, Allyson and John, you know, people looking at you, and you know, and I thought to myself, I remember coming home that night and telling Mary, my wife, that that's the first time in my life where I really sat there for a moment and thought, well, this is how the 2 black families in Basking Ridge probably felt with a lot of the different things that they did as they moved around the community, and were looked at maybe in a similar fashion when they walked into a store. And then Karina LeBlanc, African-American woman, who is now the head of women's football for CONCACAF, on our staff at Rutgers University. We were at a hotel in Chicago as we were on a road trip, and we were getting ready to enter the the elevator to go upstairs, you know, just get to our rooms or whatever. And an old white gentleman handed Karina his suitcase, you know, the black woman and the white man, thinking, well, she must be you know, working here. And Karina, to her credit, didn't say anything. And if I look back, I would have done something, because I was steaming. I was like, I think I was more stunned than anything that it was just this assumption that Karina, because she's a black woman standing there, is, you know, is the maid, is the, you know, the bellhop for you here.
Yeah, well, let's take it to sport, Glenn. Like, when I was head coach at Maryland, I don't know what percentage to put on it, but more times than not, the referee would come over looking for our roster and would go to one of my 2 assistants. You know, the referees most often thought that my assistant was the head coach, you know, and that's just, why is that? You know, I don't know the answer to it, but you know, happened more times than not.
Yeah, and I think, Glenn, you kind of alluded to a bit of like a aha moment where, you know, it kind of hit you like, oh man, this is the reality for people every single day. And I think that's why sharing stories and like speaking to your own experiences are so important, because you never know what story is going to be that person's aha moment. And I think that just being able to hear as many Black perspectives as you can, being able to find yourself in as many diverse situations as you can. Those are the only things that can really bring you as close as possible and open your eyes as much as possible to, what's going on and the oppressions that Black people are facing in America. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good story about the McDonald's. And I'm sure for you, it changed a lot of your outlook on things for a while. And that's definitely why I think that having conversations is super, super important.
Yeah, I think 4 years in downtown Brooklyn did. It was just it was an environment in a community that I hadn't, really hung out in, probably my entire life. So I considered it life changing in many ways, but that certainly was one of them. I was, I was transformed a little bit. Not the least of which we went 1-16-1 my first year, and I was about ready to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge, but we recovered from that, and I grew as a person from that as well.
So Glenn, what was that was your aha moment, but after 4 years, what was your comfort in that community? How did it change?
No, well, my comfort was because I would stay until late hours at night, 10 or 11 o'clock, and and walking back to my car in a community that's nearly 100% Black, and I became comfortable with the fact that these people that I'm dealing with, administration was mostly Black, students were mostly Black, and it was just a community that helped me understand that there's really no difference here. The only difference with some of them is that they've grown up in environments that have been very difficult, and I found that rewarding too, because I've never had to really had to want for anything. I think we've all worked hard, but and that was the other thing about that community. So I learned about associating with different people, and that it's in many ways just the same, and the fact that many of them came from underprivileged situations, which I grew up from that too.
Yeah, that's and we kind of laugh sometimes in our program, and just with some of my friends, it's like, it'd be great if we could get all of our white friends to have some sort of experience like that. So I think once you are the minority into in a situation, you don't really understand. It's hard for you to understand the eyes, the feeling, that you get, and you had obviously a very real experience, and you had that moment, right? And all of my friends, my white friends, will ask, what's the one thing we can do with our kids? And like, my thing is always just make sure all of their friends don't look like them, and so that's a really hard thing to do in some communities, but I think as a parent, you really want to help change and help your kid, you've got to find a way to make sure they have an experience with different cultures and backgrounds.
And Allison, what would your message be to someone like myself or the white community in general, in order to continue sounding the message? But what are if there's specific things, tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the biggest message I could give is like, don't check out. Don't check out when it's no longer on the news cycle, when there's something else that the televisions have moved on to. It's an everyday thing, and it's little actions. Don't also feel like you have to move mountains. Do what you can in your own individual communities, have conversations with people that are close to you. No one's asking you to go and speak in front of 100,000 people, just being able to take accountability in your own environments. And, those little actions can go a long way. And I think that would be my main message.
All right. Well, Allyson Swaby, she's a professional player for AS Roma, native of Connecticut, played at Boston College. John Morgan, University of Tennessee assistant coach, who was also my assistant at Rutgers years ago, and at the PDA. I'm thankful to you both for coming on and sharing, because this is something I've wanted to talk about, but I didn't think a group of white individuals would provide the same kind of message and experience. I know they wouldn't. So, hopefully we can help a couple of people grow from this when it gets out there. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you for having me.